All right, students, now that you've had a chance to look at some of the different evidence from the different documents and being able to come up with some ideas for what reforms you would introduce as a result of the Industrial Revolution, let's see what Great Britain actually did. All right, so how does Parliament respond to some of the conditions that are identified in the Industrial Revolution? The first thing they're going to do is going to be the Reform Act of 1832. Now, this actually doesn't have anything to do with reforming the working conditions in factories or the living conditions of these industrial cities. It has everything to do with political reform, right? Because at this point in history, only aristocrats have political power in England. Only the people who were wealthy and land or owned land could actually vote or hold positions in parliament. This meant that many of the industrial cities, such as Manchester, England, had absolutely no representation in parliament. So, what happens? Some of the growing industrial cities like Manchester start looking at this and they say, look, we need to change this. There's this growing middle class that doesn't have any representation. They're saying we want representation in there. And there are many liberal individuals throughout England who are starting to challenge this conservative ideology that the aristocrats have and saying, look, we need to expand voting rights. All right? It's this whole idea of thing called suffrage. So, what happens? Eventually, Parliament passes the Reform Act of 1832. And what happens here is that industrial cities finally gain positions in Parliament. All right? So they get some representation. Men from the middle class also get the opportunity to vote, but there are some conditions on this. The people who can vote still have to own land and they have to have some sort of education. So, not everybody gets the opportunity to vote as a result of the Reform Act because now the working class men who are working in the factories, they still don't have any representation. And the other big group of people that's still alienated from voting is going to be women. Sorry, ladies, you still don't have any voting rights here in 1832. All right, so what are some of the other reforms that occur after the Reform Act of 1832? Well, the first one that's going to be major is going to finally deal with those working conditions in factories, and that's going to be the Sadler and the Factory Act of 1833. All right, so with this one, Michael Sadler, he's a member of parliament and he starts to investigate the use of child labor in textile factories or cotton factories. And he's looking into these things and he finds that there are just some absolutely horrendous conditions that these children are forced to work in. In many cases, there's physical mistreatment and misconduct involving these children workers. They're having to work long hours and they're paid next to nothing. They have extremely low wages. After he listens to some of these different testimonies of the different children as he goes out and talks to in the different factories, he's actually just completely overwhelmed by the actual level of mistreatment that's going on here. So one of the quotes that I came across is from Thomas Wood. He's a child mill worker in one of these textile factories, and he says, "My school life came to an end when I was about 8 years old. I now went to work at John Sharp's mill at the bottom of town and which was close to the school that I had left." And he continues and he says, "We could count the whole families of children who went to work with us, who had gone to an early grave." Just recounting just how many children had lost their lives in many of these different factories. So, as a result of this, and because of his report, Parliament passes the Factory Act of 1833. And what this does is it limits the hours of that children can work in textile factories to just simply 12 hours a day. Many of them had been working 14, 16 hours a day sometimes. Now you could work no more than 12 hours a day. And if you were between the ages of 9 to 13, you had to receive at least 2 hours of schooling per weekday. All right. So now you couldn't just simply be working all the time. You had to have some education, which is a pretty significant impact. All right, another major act that Parliament passes during this time period is going to be the abolition of slavery, the Slavery Abolition Act. In this particular act, it makes slavery illegal throughout the British Empire. Britain is the first European nation to do this, and it's pretty significant. But again, a lot of this has to do with industrialization. It has to do with industrialization. So, what this act does is initially it doesn't actually free all the slaves right away. It does it over a longer period of time, over a period of about 6 years. So it slowly frees slaves over the 6 year time period. And one of the big things that it does too is it also compensates the slave owners for their loss of property. They're not just simply free and all these slave owners are now out of their investments. It also compensates those individuals to keep them happy because many of the individuals are going to be those wealthy aristocrats who are running parliament and they're looking at it saying, I don't want to go ahead and lose all of my wealth and money. I want to be compensated for these things. So it's free slavery because honestly, slavery is no longer needed in the British Empire. They have all of these individuals who are working at low wages. Slaves are not going to be as accustomed to working in these types of factories. And because they're getting many of these workers are getting paid so little anyways, it's not making a huge difference. So it's because of industrialization that slavery gets abolished in the British Empire. All right, so the last set of reforms that we're going to be looking at all deal with this one idea, and this is this idea of suffrage. And this is an important definition to know because suffrage is just simply the right to vote. All right, we've already talked about one earlier with the Reform Act of 1832. Now we're going to be continuing to look at some other ones. All right, so you don't need to know the specifics of a lot of these, but I'm going to kind of mention them anyway. One of them is going to be the People's Charter. This happens in 1839. This is where now we're trying to get some of these individuals, especially the liberals in England, are trying to get the working class and men to vote. They want the men who are in that working class, who don't own property, who are working in the factories, the ability to vote, to be able to have their voices heard as well, because they're the ones who are living in those horrible conditions. However, Parliament rejects this. They don't continue to respond to this. And it's going to take some other voting reforms beginning in the late 1860s all the way up until 1855 before you really start to get men in that working class having the ability to vote. So the push starts all the way back in 1839 to get working class men the right to vote, but it's not going to be until 1885 until the majority of working class men have the ability to vote in elections. All right. The next major reform is going to be dealing with women's suffrage. All right. Women's suffrage goes all the way back to the Enlightenment. All right. It goes all the way back to the Enlightenment. And it's going to be, again, in those 1800s during the Industrial Revolution where this is going to really pick up and gain some steam and some traction. A lot of this is going to have to do with a particular famous individual in English history, probably the most famous individual, one of the most famous individuals at least, in Queen Victoria. So Queen Victoria, she comes to power in the early 1800s. In 1837, she becomes the ruler of Great Britain. And the ironic thing about this is she's one of the most well-known queens in all of English history, yet during her entire reign, she never has the right to vote. She's queen. She's the head of the church. She's ruling all of England, yet she actually does not have the ability to vote simply because she's a woman. Right? One of these individuals who kind of looks at this is going to be Benjamin Disraeli in the 1860s. In 1866, he goes before the House of Commons and he gives a speech. And in this speech, he says, I say that in a country governed by a woman, and where a woman, by law, may be a chairwarden and an overseer of the poor, I do not see, when she has so much to do with the state and with the church, on what reason she has not a right to vote. He's completely baffled by English law at the time where we're denying women the right to vote, even though they have so much influence on our society. They're working in factories now. They're helping out in managing the poor. The Queen of England is ruling the entire country. She's the head of the church, yet she does not have the right to vote. He's completely baffled by this. However, it's going to take a major world event before women get actually the right to vote, and then we gain women's suffrage in England during this time period. It's not going to be until 1918. That's right after World War I, before women over the age of 30 get the right to vote in England. Not until after World War I do women gain the right to vote. And it's going to be another decade yet until 1928 when women's voting rights are going to be equal to that of men, where men and women of the same age are able to vote and have the same voting rights. So still, it takes a long time period, even after Industrial Revolution is really starting to quiet down a little bit more, until England allows women the right to vote. So now that you've had a chance to see what actual reforms occur in Great Britain during the time period of Industrial Revolution, I want you to compare and contrast those with the reforms that you guys came up with. All right? So I want you to take the things that actually happened, see what things you have that are in common with what you came up with, and what are some of those things that are missing. All right? So on Schoology, I want you to go ahead and compare and contrast these two things. So do one short little paragraph saying, all right, these are the things that were similar. These were some of the things that were different. All right? Make sure you really clearly identify. These are the ones that actually happened, and these are the ones that we came up with when you're comparing and contrasting those. How are they the same? How are they different? All right? And that's going to be your homework for the next class period.